In the offseason, Brian Kelly made some comments about the championship timeline that I know didn't sit very well with a lot of LSU fans. And this past week at SEC Media Days in Nashville, Brian Kelly doubled down on it. But today I am here to tell you that I think it's going to be okay. And I kind of like what he's doing.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Also, we're on YouTube as well. So if you listen on your preferred podcast platform when you're on the go, thank you for tuning in. But you can also check us out and watch us on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button and you'll get notified as soon as our podcasts drop. However you listen, wherever you listen, just appreciate you for being here and always appreciate you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every single day. My name is Caroline Fenton, and I am your host, as I am every single day. You can follow me on Twitter at CarolineFenton1. You can also follow along with the podcast for updates at Locked On LSU. Just a reminder, we're getting back into our weekly mailbags, so feel free to send in your questions whenever you would like. You can send them in on Twitter at CarolineFenton1, or you can comment them below on YouTube. But let's get into it, because let's first, before we get into the latest, let's recap what this is all kind of based on. So at the beginning of June, Brian Kelly sat down with Blake Toppmeyer of USA Today and discussed everything this past season, how they got there, what they've done in the offseason, expectations for this upcoming season. The accent came up, which I guess it's going to be a thing from now until forever. We're never going to quite shake that, however stale it's getting, but whatever. But they just kind of discussed everything. And in that sit down, Blake Toppmeyer asked Brian Kelly, hey, like, what's the realistic timeline where LSU can be legitimately contending for a national title? Brian Kelly said, we need another year of recruiting. One more really good year on both sides of the ball, I think, puts us in a position where I think year 3, the consistency piece, the depth of our program, the messaging, all the things we do on a day-to-day basis, puts us in a position to compete for a championship. And I know a lot of you, myself included, like you probably read that and thought, well, dang it. I want my coach to get up there and say, right now's the timeline. We're getting ready for a natty right now. But I broke this down on a few podcasts ago. You can find that on your preferred podcast platform or on YouTube to kind of get a refresher, my full breakdown of what he had to say there. But the new piece of this is that this past week in Nashville, Brian Kelly kind of doubled down on the fact that this team is a team that's on a timeline and they're not quite there on the timeline where they can be competitive. This was Brian Kelly in his opening statement about where this team really is right now.
Where we are in year 2 is that we have a football team that's coming. They're moving in the right direction. We still have some weaknesses that we're working on. We still have some roster development that still needs to take place. I think the exciting parts are keeping your staff together, and the continuity of our staff with our coordinators and leadership is in place. That will make it for seamless communication as it relates to our day-to-day. But going into this season, it certainly is going to be a great challenge for us as we open up against an outstanding Florida State team, which will challenge our football team. But it also motivates us on a day-to-day basis.
So what he said there just kind of gives me the same vibe. I feel like it has the same tone as what he said to Blake Toppmeyer of, hey, we're in a good position right now. We've been recruiting well. We have a lot of retention, like where our coaching staff is at right now, but we are still a team that's building. We're still a team that has holes. And there was even another comment where Brian Kelly doubled down again of, hey, we're in a good spot right now, but just not quite the cream of the crop of the SEC.
Obviously, Georgia is the standard in the conference right now. I'm just curious, how do you close the gap with what they've been doing, and do you feel your program's doing that?
It's a measurement of, for everybody in here to see it on the field, right? That's how everybody measures, is the gap closing. What's the score of the game? What's the eye test tell me? What's the competitiveness of that game? We'll only have that opportunity if we get into the championship game against Georgia. I know that based upon how we've recruited and how we'll continue to recruit, that we'll have a football roster that will be able to compete against Georgia. Is that right now? No, it's not. But if we continue to do what we're doing, we're going to have a roster that can compete against Georgia, and then it's just a matter of getting it done on the playing field so everybody then can assess they've closed the gap.
Coach, we'll go right here in front of us, here on the left.
Apologies for not trimming that end of the clip there. A whole lot of coach speak leading up to the really meat and potatoes of that answer and that response from Brian Kelly there. He's saying, hey, we've been recruiting really well, but we're just not quite there yet with being competitive with Georgia. And when I heard that, I'm like, dang, of course I want my coach to say, yep, absolutely. We feel like we can compete with the best in the conference right now. Those two clips that I played from Brian Kelly at the podium on Monday at SEC Media Days from this past week, in combination and in congruence with his response with Blake Toppmeyer at USA Today, all of that just kind of jumbled together in an overall summary of Brian Kelly's view of this team, and that is, we're good and we like what we've been doing, but we're just not quite there yet. And I know that's not really great for any of us to hear, but I will say this. Do we disagree? Of course, Brian Kelly has a much better idea of where this team is at, of how they're recruiting and how the team is coming along, how they've been practicing, how much better this team is today than they were the last time we saw them compete against Purdue in the Citrus Bowl in January. Brian Kelly has a much better idea of that. But from what we know about this team, do we think that they're poised to compete legitimately right now, what we know, for a national title? I think absolutely they can. Am I going to put my money on LSU to win the national title today? No, I'm not. It's not a crazy conversation to have at all. Jaden Daniels in the Heisman discussion is not a crazy conversation to have at all. But where it stands right now, LSU's not with Georgia. They're not. Georgia won back-to-back national championships. Georgia might have the best player in college football, Brock Bowers, on their team. You could also say that LSU does too, and Harold Perkins. But overall, where the roster stands, I don't think that LSU is quite up there with Georgia. So as disappointing as it is to hear that from Brian Kelly, I think it's realistic. And also, let's keep in mind that Brian Kelly's not going to get up at the podium and start gloating and bloviating about how he expects his team to win a national championship this year. You don't want your coach to do that. As fun as it would be, and as much as we would be like, hey, yeah, that's my coach, he's not going to do that. That only creates bulletin board material for every other team on LSU's schedule, and it only creates unfair expectations for the fan base. What Brian Kelly is doing is tapering expectations. What Brian Kelly is doing is playing it safe, playing the aw shucks, woe is me card. Does he think that his team can compete for a national championship? I bet he does. I bet he does. I'm not willing to say that they're going to win a national title today. But again, I'll double down on that. Do I think it's out of the question? No. Do I think that we're going to get to a point in the season where it's a legitimate conversation of LSU being a college football playoff contender? Yes, I do. But I think all Brian Kelly is doing is tapering expectations, playing it cool, under the radar. And what the important thing is what the conversations are in the locker room. And that's what I want to get into coming up next. But before we do that, I want to tell you about FanDuel. Y'all know how much I love FanDuel because it is the best. And you can take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 that you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. That's all on an app that's so safe, so secure, and oh so super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. That's one of my favorite things about the FanDuel Sportsbook app is when I place a bet and I win that bet, I can log into my account and I know that money is going to be waiting for me almost instantly. You don't have to wait around for 3 to 5 business days. Nope. FanDuel pays their bets. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Well, thanks again for making Locked On LSU your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Every dayers coming up tomorrow on the podcast. I've said before, I think that this team is in so much better shape because it's heading into year 2. And Jaden Daniels makes this team so much in better shape now than they were last year because he's stepping into year 2. He has this newfound confidence. And I want to get into that, break all of that down and what he had to say at SEC Media Days on tomorrow's edition of Locked On LSU. But for now, breaking down what Brian Kelly had to say, his expectations, his evaluation of where this team is at right now. And he said at SEC Media Days, hey, look, we're a team that's building, and that's okay. It's only year 2. If you're a team that's building, that doesn't mean that you can't also be a contender. If you're a team that's building, that doesn't mean that you can't also make a run and win the games on your schedule that you're supposed to win, and maybe even win games on your schedule that you're not supposed to win. Every team in America is building. Georgia's building, and they're the favorite for the national championship. Alabama is building, and they were picked to win the SEC West this year. So if you're a team that's building, that doesn't mean that's a bad thing. It means that you're poised for the future, but also, hey, you're also poised right now. So I wouldn't look too far into it, what Brian Kelly said, whether it was what he said to Blake Toppmeyer about the national championship timeline, whether it was what he said at the podium about being able to compete with the Georgias of the SEC, about being a team that's building. Don't look too far into it. He's tapering expectations. That's what he's supposed to say. It's coach speak, after all. But I think the important thing is not what Brian Kelly tells us about what he thinks this team can do, but what he tells the team in the locker room about what this team can do. Because I've got a good feeling that the shtick that he's giving us, the media, the fans at the podium, is much different than the conversation that's happening behind closed doors in that locker room. It's much different than the conversations that he's having with his players one-on-one or on the practice field. Because while he's telling us, hey, we're a team that's building, I have to think he's telling his players, hey, we are a team that can absolutely make some noise, that can make a splash this season. But how the players feel about that behind closed doors and how the players talk about it behind closed doors is also different about how they speak about it publicly. Because one question that I asked when I heard that Blake Toppmeyer sit down was, how do the players feel about this? Jaden Daniels gave us a little bit of a breakdown about what his expectations are. Because he was asked when he spoke with the media, hey, Kim Mulkey in her second year, women's basketball won a national championship. Jay Johnson in his second year, he won the College World Series. Brian Kelly's going into his second year. There's a whole lot of winning happening on campus in Baton Rouge. Do you feel a little bit of that pressure going into Brian Kelly's second year? This was what Jaden Daniels had to say to that.
It's a blessing, obviously, what those two other teams did with the women's basketball and baseball. It's second to none. They could go out there and they both won championships. Hopefully we could follow up with one, but, other than that, we got to take it day by day and really just enjoy the process, enjoy the season with each other.
He's saying what he's supposed to say. Credit to baseball and women's basketball. They're killing it. It's a fun time. It's fun to be an LSU student and an LSU student athlete. And hey, do we want to win a championship? Of course we do. But we got to take it day by day. We got to put in the work. It's game by game. We can't be thinking about a national title right now. We got Florida State. We can't be thinking about Alabama right now. We got to play Florida State first. We think about week 1 before we think about week 5, before we think about the postseason. So Brian Kelly is getting the same media training that Jaden Daniels and every other player on this roster is getting. It's, hey, we don't need to be out there talking about how we're going to win a national title. We don't need to be out there flaunting what we're talking about behind closed doors. We don't need to be putting targets on our backs and creating bulletin board material for Florida State and for Alabama and for Ole Miss and for Auburn and so on and so forth. We don't need to be doing that. We're going to be humble. We're going to take it in stride, and we're going to, quote unquote, take it day by day. They're just saying what they're supposed to say. Don't think too far into it. And don't think for a single second that this team doesn't have a championship on their mind. Don't think about that for a single second. But coming up next, I want to get into what I heard this past week, what I heard from Jaden Daniels and from Josh Williams about their relationship with Brian Kelly and why it made me so excited and encouraged for not just this season, but about how Brian Kelly is just the right fit. And we'll get into that coming up next. Well, thanks again for making Locked On LSU your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. So let's rewind to, what was this? December of 2021, January of 2022, when Brian Kelly was hired. They made the announcement that Brian Kelly was going to be the next head football coach of LSU. Your thought was probably similar or the exact same to my first thought, and that was, it's interesting. I mean, the guy who's been at Notre Dame for like forever, who has spent his career coaching and recruiting in the Northeast and the Midwest, gonna come to LSU. It's odd. Was not on my bingo card. And I think there was a whole lot of speculation, not just across the LSU fan base between you and me, but between really all of college football and all of sports fans, was how on God's green earth is that going to work? And that skepticism existed and kind of floated around all throughout the offseason. And really, until LSU beat Alabama, there was still already a whole lot of skepticism. Remember after the Florida State game this past year, when, LSU just didn't look very well coached, didn't look prepared. I thought, well, I mean, that's on Brian Kelly. That's on coaching. When every time the camera panned to Brian Kelly, he was just kind of standing on the sidelines, just looking perplexed without a whole lot of emotion. And I thought, what is this man doing? Every doubt and fear that I had about his fit with this team was all coming to fruition. It's the same feeling across the national media. But then Brian Kelly turned this team around. Then they started winning. Then they beat Alabama. Then they won the SEC West. Then any question or skeptic about the Brian Kelly LSU fit kind of dissolved. Because he was a fit. Because he came to LSU in year 1 and beat Alabama and won the SEC West. But you need to do more than that, right? Because wins on the field are all kind of a culmination of what you do behind the scenes. You need to have the locker room. You need to have their trust. You need to have their confidence. You need to have their utmost attention. Overall, your players need to respect you. Overall, your players need to want to play for you. And I know that there's a whole lot of coach speak at the podium, and I know I just went over, how Jaden Daniels and Brian Kelly were just saying the right things. But there was something that I heard from Josh Williams that made me think, man, like if I had any question about Brian Kelly's fit before, those questions are now answered a little bit more. Those concerns are now eased because it didn't just come from on-the-field product, from on the field results. It's coming from a more holistic point of view, from a locker room point of view. This is LSU running back Josh Williams on his relationship with Brian Kelly.
It seemed like last season you guys had incredible success in close games, and I was just wondering if there's anything about the team that you think led to the fact that whenever the game came down to one possession, it felt like LSU won.
I believe that the guys in our locker room, we're very tight-knit, and we don't take losing lightly. We're very competitive, even in practice, or it could be a bag toss. Everybody on the team is very competitive, and when we're in a close, tight game and you have your head coach, Coach Kelly, pouring his heart out into you, telling you to give it your all, we just go out there and give it our all, and we just throw our hearts against the line for the win.
So, again, that was Josh Williams, LSU running back at SEC Media Days. And that stood out to me for two reasons about why I think that was important and why it continues to prove that Brian Kelly was the right fit for this job. One, he talks about how it's a really competitive locker room, how even if it's just a bag toss, they're fighting against each other and they want to win. That's a culture that Brian Kelly created. I do think that there's always, in a certain way, in an LSU locker room, when you have the talent that those guys have, the desire to win that those guys have, you're not going to be in LSU's locker room if you don't have those attributes. But that's a culture of competitiveness that Brian Kelly instilled and has fostered. And I think that's important, because how are you expected to go out there every single Saturday and compete every down, every second, every quarter, every week, if you're not feeling that sort of sense of competition inside the locker room every single day? How do you expect to get the most out of all of your players when you're not constantly pushing each other, when you don't constantly have that desire and that drive to win? That's what Brian Kelly created in this locker room. There's no sort of laziness. There's no sort of lethargy in the locker room, which I feel like at the end of at Coach O's tenure that we felt that. It was laziness. Like, it was just no sense of urgency out on the football field. And I have to think that comes from the fact that there was no sense of urgency from the top all the way to the bottom. So Brian Kelly has created a culture of competitiveness. The second thing is he's saying, look, when we're in a game and we're probably exhausted, it's either hot as hell or it's freezing and it's the fourth quarter and we've been battling and we're tired and our bodies hurt. What keeps us going is our desire to win for our coach. When our coach is out there pouring his heart out for us, when he's worked hard for us, when he's motivating us, we want to win for him. That's important. I think that's really, really important. Your team has to want to win. And when things get hard, like, it's easy to win. It's easy to have culture when you're winning. It's really hard to still have that drive to win when you lose. It's hard to have a positive culture when you're losing. Let's say back-to-back, let's say even if it doesn't have to be a loss on the scoreboard. If you lose a drive, if you lose a quarter, what continues to keep your team going is the culture and the drive to win. And they want to do that for Brian Kelly. So a guy that we all thought, like, what? How in the world is he going to be able to connect with his players? A guy from Boston who's coached in Indiana his whole life. How is he going to get these kids from South Louisiana and Josh Williams from Houston? How is he going to get this team rallied around him? Well, Josh Williams just told you, we won a whole lot of close games because we wanted to compete for our coach. And that is the kind of coach that I want coaching my team. So even if you had zero concerns about Brian Kelly, I hope you have even fewer now that you heard that. But that's going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every single day. Every dayers coming up tomorrow on the podcast. A little Jaden Daniels glow up. What we can expect from him this season and why we can expect it. We'll get into that on tomorrow's edition of Locked On LSU.